After her husband saved her life in a terrible accident, Alyssa Monroe woke up in a hospital bed holding the hand of the man who gave up everything to keep her alive. Her husband, Nathaniel Rhodes, the quiet architect everyone called too gentle for this world. He sold his car, maxed out his cards, and donated his own blood just to make sure she'd breathe again. But when her scars faded and the pain was gone, so was her gratitude. She divorced him, emptied their joint account, and ran to her secret lover, a man she thought could give her the life Nate never could. Now, the husband who once saved her life watches from the shadows as the woman he almost died for builds her new world on betrayal. But what happens when the man who once saved her life decides he's done saving her? Why would a wife betray the very man who rescued her from death? And when the truth finally comes crashing down, what will he do that will shock her and everyone who thought they knew him? The accident had been brutal rain, hammering down on the Dallas Bridge, the night split open by screeching tires and shattering glass. Alyssa's car had spun twice before slamming into the guardrail, the sound of metal against metal echoing like thunder. Nate had been minutes behind her, chasing after the last text she sent, "Don't wait up." When he found her wrecked car upside down, smoke curling into the air, something inside him broke. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her out through shattered glass, cutting his hands, shouting her name until her chest rose again. That was the night love nearly killed him. Days later, the hospital room smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Alyssa lay pale, her lips cracked, her voice barely a whisper when she saw him. "You stayed?" she asked. Nate, eyes swollen from sleepless nights, only smiled. Where else would I be? He had refused to leave, sitting by her side even when nurses urged him to rest. He fed her soup with trembling hands, wiped her forehead, and paid every bill without a second thought. Everyone in the hospital whispered about his devotion, how a man could love someone that fiercely. But Alyssa, beneath the soft white sheets, didn't feel gratitude. She felt humiliation. Every time he looked at her with tenderness, she saw pity. Every time he said, "You're safe now," she heard, "You're weak." The man who had saved her life became the mirror she couldn't bear to look into. He had seen her broken, bleeding, helpless, and to her, that meant he would never again see her as powerful. As she healed, her resentment grew. She started scrolling through old messages from Elliot Vance, Nate's former business partner, charming, successful, the kind of man who made her feel seen, not saved. Elliot's texts came with promises Nate never made. "You deserve more. You were born for more." And slowly, Alyssa began believing them. The night she walked out of the hospital, Nate held her coat and whispered, "Let's go home." She smiled faintly, kissed his cheek, and said, "Yes, home." But in her heart, home no longer meant him. She was already gone, lost to her hunger for control, blind to the quiet man beside her who had given everything. And as the city lights blurred past their car windows, Nate's hand found hers, warm and steady. She didn't squeeze back. The first few weeks after the accident felt like the calm after a storm. Nate woke every morning to the sound of rainwater dripping from the gutters outside their Dallas townhouse, whispering prayers of gratitude that she'd survived. He cooked her breakfast, fluffed her pillows, and carried her to the balcony where sunlight touched her face. To him, those mornings meant healing. To Alyssa, they meant confinement. Every soft gesture reminded her of how close she'd come to dying, and of how dependent she'd become on a man she once admired for his strength. When neighbors stopped by with casseroles and get-well cards, they praised Nate as the perfect husband. "You're lucky, Alyssa," they'd say. "Not every man would do what he did." She would nod, smiling politely, but inside, resentment simmered. Lucky. The word made her skin crawl. She didn't want to be seen as the woman who was saved. She wanted to be the woman people envied. She wanted to reclaim the power she'd lost somewhere between the accident and the hospital bed. Nate didn't see it coming. He believed her silence was recovery, not distance. At night, he'd read to her from the architecture journals he loved, talking about the skyscraper he and his partner, Elliot, were designing, a sleek glass tower meant to symbolize renewal. "I wanted to stand for something," Nate said softly one night, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Like second chances." Alyssa forced a smile. She couldn't tell him that every mention of Elliot's name made her pulse quicken, not with admiration, but with a dangerous, growing curiosity. Elliot Vance had always been the opposite of Nate Loud, where Nate was quiet, ambitious where Nate was content. At company events, he made everyone laugh, his expensive cologne filling the air. Alyssa had noticed him long before the accident, though she'd never dared cross that line. But something in her shifted after the crash. Gratitude had decayed into guilt, and guilt needed escape. When Elliot sent her a message saying, "If you ever need to talk about anything," she replied. Their conversations began as friendly check-ins, but soon turned into long late-night calls about dreams, regrets, and ambition. He told her she'd been wasted in domestic life, that she had a spark Nate could never understand. He made her feel seen, admired, powerful again. When Nate came home from work one evening to find her dressed in silk instead of pajamas, he thought it was a good sign. "You look beautiful," he said warmly. Alyssa only shrugged. "It's just clothes, Nate." One night, when Nate mentioned that the company was struggling and he might need to borrow from their joint savings to keep projects afloat, she froze. Elliot's words echoed in her head. "He's building for others, not for you." That night, as Nate slept, Alyssa stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She remembered the accident, his hands trembling as he pulled her from the wreckage, his voice begging her to breathe. She owed him everything, and yet, all she felt was trapped. By morning, she'd already texted Elliot, "Let's talk about starting something of our own." The next morning, sunlight poured into the kitchen, painting everything gold, but the warmth didn't reach Alyssa. She sat at the counter, stirring her coffee, her phone hidden beneath the newspaper Nate had placed there before heading to work. The message from Elliot blinked again on her screen. "Lunch today? We'll discuss the proposal." Her heart pounded, not from love, but from the thrill of stepping into something forbidden. By noon, she was sitting across from Elliot at a rooftop restaurant overlooking downtown Dallas. He wore his usual confidence like a tailored suit, leaning forward as he spoke. "Alyssa, you've always had vision. Nate's a good man, but good men rarely build empires. They build comfort." His voice was smooth, persuasive, dangerous. She hated that it made sense. For years, she'd played the role of the supportive wife, attending architectural galas and smiling on cue while Nate talked about urban sustainability. She'd wanted more, her name on something, her signature on contracts, her life filled with motion, not gratitude. Elliot saw that hunger and fed it. He pulled out a folder and slid it toward her. "The Monarch brand," he said. "A luxury event design firm. You'll be the face, the brand, the story. I'll handle investors and infrastructure. All we need is seed money." She opened the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she saw her name printed on mock business cards. Alyssa Monroe, creative director. It was everything she'd ever wanted, her own empire. The only problem was where the money would come from. That evening, Nate came home exhausted, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the faint scent of sawdust clinging to him. He found her by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "You've been quiet," he said gently. "Are you still in pain?" She turned toward him with a smile too calm to be real. "No. I was just thinking about us, about how we can make things better." He nodded, relief softening his features. "I've been thinking the same. Maybe we should take a trip once everything at work settles down." She walked over, slipped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "You deserve rest." But behind that tender tone, a plan was forming. The next week, she began handling the couple's finances again, something Nate had entrusted her with since before the accident. He didn't notice the quiet transfers, a few thousand here, 10,000 there, small amounts hidden under project expenses. He didn't see the subtle tension in her shoulders each time he mentioned Elliot, or the way she avoided his gaze when he asked, "Do you ever think we got lucky?" At night, when Nate fell asleep beside her, Alyssa stared at him in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The man who once saved her life now felt like a weight she needed to shed. She remembered the wreckage, the smell of gasoline, his blood on her face, his arms pulling her from death. That moment should have bound her to him forever. Instead, it made her feel indebted, and debt was something Alyssa Monroe refused to live under. The last thing Nate saw before falling asleep was her silhouette by the window, outlined against the moonlight. She whispered something he couldn't hear, a secret promise, to herself. By morning, she would begin building her new life, one that didn't include the man who once saved hers. Alyssa's transformation began quietly, like a house losing its foundation, one brick at a time. She started spending more evenings out with clients, wearing perfume Nate had never smelled before, and coming home with her hair styled differently. She stopped talking about recovery or gratitude and began talking about possibilities. When Nate mentioned money being tighter than usual, she smiled and said, "I'll handle it. Don't worry." He took her at her word. He always did. Behind his back, she met with Elliot twice a week. Their new company, the Monarch brand, started taking shape on stolen funds and whispered plans. Elliot handled the legal papers while she handled the image. Soft pastels, gold logos, luxury branding that screamed prestige. They were careful at first, but success, even the illusion of it, made Alyssa reckless. She started attending small investor dinners as Alyssa Monroe, creative director. Every smile from strangers fed the belief that she was becoming someone important. At home, Nate stayed late at the firm, trying to fix the chaos Elliot had caused with careless bids. He thought his partner was overworked, not deceitful. When he mentioned it one night over dinner, Alyssa's fork froze midway to her lips. "You and Elliot argue too much," she said, forcing a casual laugh. "Maybe you're both just stressed." Nate nodded, tired, never imagining she was already plotting to leave him for that same man. The night everything began to unravel. Rain beat against their windows again, just like the night of the accident. Alyssa stood by the kitchen counter with her phone glowing in her hand, reading Elliot's text. "Everything's ready. You just need to move the rest of the funds." She looked at Nate asleep on the couch, his sketchbook open beside him, a drawing of a half-finished tower smudged with pencil dust. His head rested against the cushions, his breathing soft and steady. For a fleeting second, guilt brushed her heart, but it passed. Moving quietly, she sat at his desk and opened the laptop. Her fingers trembled as she logged into their joint account. The cursor blinked beside the numbers that represented his trust, his hard work, his dreams. She entered the transfer amount, every remaining dollar. The screen went blank for a second, then flashed. "Transaction successful." She exhaled, slow and shaky, feeling both liberated and terrified. When Nate woke later, he found her by the window in her robe, staring into the storm. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She turned, smiling faintly. "Just thinking." He walked over, kissed her forehead and whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. The next morning, she was gone. A note lay on the kitchen counter beside his coffee cup. "Don't try to find me. This isn't your fault." Nate stood there for minutes, the world tilting around him, the silence deafening. He didn't know it yet, but the woman he once dragged from death had just left him bleeding in a different way. Nate stood in the middle of their living room, the note still trembling in his hand, his heartbeat loud enough to drown out the world. Morning light cut through the blinds in pale stripes, illuminating the space that suddenly felt foreign. Her perfume lingered faintly on the couch cushions. Her mug sat half-washed in the sink, and her shoes were gone from the doorway. He read the note again, hoping he'd misread the words, but they didn't change. "Don't try to find me." He called her phone 3 times, straight to voicemail. Then once more, just to hear her recorded voice say, "Leave a message." He couldn't. His mouth opened, but no words came. When he finally set the phone down, his reflection stared back at him in the darkened TV screen, a man who had given everything to save someone who decided he wasn't worth keeping alive. For days, he functioned like a machine. He still went to the firm, still wore the same navy suit, still greeted the receptionist, but inside, something in him had stopped moving. Elliot pretended surprise when Nate told him Alyssa had left. "Man, I'm sorry," he said, eyes darting too quickly away. "You deserve better." Nate nodded numbly, unaware that the man speaking pity was the same one sharing Alyssa's bed that very night. The company began to feel hollow without her quiet presence at events, but he told himself it was fine. Until one morning he arrived early and overheard 2 junior architects whispering near the printer. "Did you see the article? The Monarch brand huge launch party this weekend. Alyssa Monroe, creative genius behind the concept." Nate froze. The name hit him like a punch to the chest. He walked past them without a word, locking himself in his office. His laptop screen glowed with the article's headline, her photo smiling beside Elliot's. The caption read, "A power couple reimagining Dallas luxury." He stared at the image for a long time. Every memory of her, the laughter, the hospital nights, the promises folding into disbelief. Then something quieter settled in. Not rage, not sorrow, but stillness. A kind of clarity that hurt less than anger and more than heartbreak. He printed the article, folded it carefully, and slid it into the back of his sketchbook. Then he opened a fresh page and began to draw shaky lines at first, then stronger. He drew a new structure rising from a cracked foundation. Beneath it, he wrote one word: Phoenix. That night, as rain returned, Nate sat by the window she used to love, watching lightning fracture the sky. His hands still bore faint scars from the accident, pale reminders of the night he'd saved her. He whispered into the glass, "I saved your life, Alyssa. I just didn't realize you'd take mine with you." Then he closed the curtains and, for the first time in weeks, slept without dreams. The weeks that followed blurred into something weightless, a routine of survival disguised as work. Nate went to the firm each morning, nodding politely to people who looked at him with quiet pity. His office, once bright with models, sketches, and laughter, felt stripped of air. The blueprints on his desk blurred when he tried to focus. The words of clients drifted past him like static. He answered calls without hearing the voices. One evening, he returned home to find an envelope slid under his door. Inside was an invitation printed on thick ivory paper. The Monarch brand, Grand Launch, Gala Elliott Vance, and Alyssa Monroe. The date shimmered in gold ink. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, fingers tightening around the edge until the paper bent. Then he laughed low, hollow, a sound that frightened even him. He didn't go. He couldn't. Instead, he spent that night at his drafting table, the glow of the lamp the only light in the room. He worked until dawn, sketching and erasing, lines crossing lines, blueprints filled with impossible structures, bridges that led nowhere, towers without doors. When his pencil finally stilled, he looked at the mess of drawings and whispered, "That's what loving her felt like." The following Monday, he arrived at the firm to find Elliot in his office, all charm and false concern. "You've been quiet, Nate. Thought I'd check in." Nate met his eyes for the first time since the divorce. "You look busy," he said evenly. "I hear Monarch's taking off." Elliot smiled thinly. "Trying to? Yeah. We'll see how long the momentum lasts." There was something smug behind the politeness, a glint of victory too rehearsed. Nate said nothing. He simply picked up a stack of reports and walked out. By the end of the month, the firm began to crumble under Elliot's recklessness, missed deadlines, angry investors, vanished funds. Nate resigned quietly, taking with him nothing but his sketchbooks and a single plant from the window. He left a note for Elliot on the desk. "Integrity is the only structure that never collapses." For a while, he drifted. Days bled into nights. He jogged at dawn, not to clear his mind, but to outrun his thoughts. It was during one of those runs that he first saw her again, the nurse from the hospital, Samantha Blake. She was standing outside a small bakery, her hair tied back, coffee in one hand, a medical bag in the other. When she recognized him, her face softened. "You were the husband, right?" she asked gently. "The one who never left her side." He nodded, unsure what to say. "You remembered," she smiled. "Some people you don't forget." They began running into each other often after that, at the bakery, the park, the grocery store. She spoke in simple, kind sentences that didn't ask for anything in return. One afternoon, when she noticed the bruised look in his eyes, she said quietly, "You can't rebuild on ashes. You have to clear the ground first." It was the first piece of advice that didn't sound like pity. That night, Nate reopened his sketchbook. He turned past the page marked Phoenix and drew something new. A foundation, strong and clean. Beneath it, he wrote one line: "Start again." Months passed, and silence became Nate's companion rather than his punishment. The ache in his chest no longer screamed, it hummed quietly, like background music to a man rebuilding himself piece by piece. He rented a small studio downtown, bare walls and one large drafting table, and began taking freelance design work under a new name. The space smelled of paper, dust, and hope. Every morning, he poured black coffee into a chipped mug, opened his sketchbook, and whispered to himself, one line at a time. Samantha appeared often, bringing him pastries and conversation. She never pried about the past. She spoke of small things, the patients she'd comforted, the night shifts that felt endless, the joy of seeing people survive. She had her own scars, though she never named them. When Nate once said, "You make it look easy," she smiled faintly. "I just got tired of breaking." Her quiet resilience fascinated him. By spring, his sketches had matured into concepts, sleek, innovative designs that caught the eye of a developer named James Rowe, a longtime admirer of his early work. They met by chance at a cafe when Rowe noticed the faint initials NR on the corner of a blueprint. "You're still designing," Rowe said, surprised. Nate hesitated, then nodded. "Trying to," Rowe grinned. "Dallas needs you back. Let me help." Reluctantly, Nate agreed to a meeting. Within weeks, Rowe introduced him to investors eager to work with him again. And from those meetings, Rhodes Atelier Designs was born, a firm that operated quietly but delivered excellence. Nate refused interviews, refused credit. He wanted the work to speak louder than his name. "I don't need to be seen," he told Samantha one night. "I just need to build," she replied softly. Sometimes that's how healing looks. Meanwhile, Alyssa and Elliot's empire was booming, or at least it looked that way. Photos of them attending galas flooded social media, her diamonds gleaming, his hand always around her waist. The world saw glamour. Only Nate saw the cracks forming. From business articles and industry whispers, he learned that Monarch was over-leveraged. Their growth depended on debt, their image on illusion. He didn't rejoice. He simply noted it. But as Monarch grew louder, Rhodes Atelier grew stronger. Nate's projects began winning silent bids across the city. His architectural style, minimalist, symbolic, emotionally charged, became the new standard. Even his rivals admired the precision. When Samantha brought him to dinner one late evening and found him asleep over a sketch, she draped her cardigan over his shoulders and whispered, "You're coming back." Still, there were nights when he'd pause mid-design, staring at an old photo tucked in the corner of his table, Alyssa smiling at him from years ago. He didn't feel rage anymore, just distance, like remembering a stranger. "You taught me patience," he murmured once before turning the photo face down. It was on one of those quiet nights, surrounded by blueprints of the future, that a notification blinked across his laptop. Monarch brand, invitation to gala. His firm had been shortlisted for a major collaboration. The host was listed as Elliot Vance. Nate leaned back, the faintest smile touching his lips. "So," he whispered, "the storm comes to me now." The night of the gala arrived draped in luxury. Dallas shimmered beneath a sky of silver clouds as limousines lined the entrance to the Grand Skyline Hotel. The banners read, "The Monarch brand, celebrating excellence in partnership." Inside, chandeliers blazed above polished marble floors, and champagne glasses sparkled in the hands of people who spoke in the language of money. Among them was Alyssa Monroe, now Alyssa Vance, the woman the city hailed as a self-made visionary. She wore a golden silk gown that caught every flash of light, her smile rehearsed, her laughter a little too loud. Elliot stood beside her, radiating confidence. He shook hands, posed for photos, and whispered to her between smiles, "See? You worried for nothing. We're untouchable now." Alyssa smiled back, but her stomach twisted. There was something about the night, the whispers, the unfamiliar faces that felt wrong. Then, over the crowd's murmur, the host's voice echoed through the ballroom speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our special keynote speaker and the mind behind Rhodes Atelier Designs, Mr. Nathaniel Rhodes." Every sound in the room died. Glasses stilled midair. Alyssa's breath caught in her throat. For a second, she thought she'd misheard, but then the applause began soft at first, then swelling like a wave. And there he was. Nate walked onto the stage dressed in a black tailored suit, calm, composed, every step deliberate. He looked nothing like the broken man she'd left behind. The audience rose to their feet, but Alyssa remained frozen, fingers tightening around her glass until it cracked. Nate adjusted the microphone, his voice smooth but steady. "Tonight isn't about competition," he said. "It's about integrity, because the structures we build will only stand if the hands that design them are clean." His gaze swept across the crowd before settling, for just a heartbeat, on Alyssa. She felt it like a pulse beneath her skin. He didn't name her, didn't mention betrayal, but every word was a mirror held to her face. Beside her, Elliot forced a grin. "Guess he's trying to make a comeback," he whispered, his tone brittle. Alyssa couldn't answer. Her throat was dry, her palms cold. When Nate stepped down from the stage, reporters swarmed him, eager to capture the man the world thought had vanished. Cameras flashed. The light reflected off his calm eyes. And for the first time in years, Alyssa realized what true power looked like. Not noise, not wealth, but composure. Later, Nate walked past her table. "Mr. Rhodes," she managed to say, her voice trembling. He paused, turned toward her, and smiled faintly. "Mrs. Vance," he replied evenly. "Good to see you standing." The simple sentence landed heavier than any insult could. Elliot extended his hand awkwardly. "Didn't expect to see you here, Nate." Nate shook it without hesitation, his expression unreadable. "I go where integrity takes me," he said, then walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of quiet victory. As the night wore on, Alyssa watched him surrounded by investors, journalists, admirers. Every person who once ignored him now sought his attention. Her chest ached, not from love, but from the realization that she'd built her empire on the ruins of the man she'd underestimated. The husband she divorced after he saved her life had not just survived, he had returned as everything she pretended to be. When the gala ended, Dallas buzzed with Nate's name again. Every business blog, every investor circle, every whispered conversation over cocktails repeated it. Nathaniel Rhodes is back. Photos of him from the event flooded social media. The composed architect shaking hands, smiling faintly, standing beside top investors. To the city, he was a phoenix reborn. To Alyssa, he was the ghost she thought she'd buried. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay beside Elliot in their penthouse suite, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioner. Elliot slept soundly, but her mind spun. Every image of Nate's calm face at the gala replayed in her head the confidence, the subtle weight in his words. He hadn't needed to humiliate her publicly. Just existing in that room had done it. She turned onto her side and whispered to herself, "He's different now." For the first time in years, fear slipped beneath her pride. Meanwhile, across town, Nate sat alone in his office, the city lights spilling through the tall windows. The gala hadn't been about spectacle. It had been the first chess move in a long-planned game. On his desk lay folders marked with Monarch's supply partners, venues, decorators, transport companies, all entities he now quietly controlled. Through shell firms and strategic acquisitions, he had already positioned himself inside their empire. They just didn't know it yet. He opened one file marked Logistics, flipping through contracts that carried the Monarch brand signature. The ink was still fresh. "Signed by Alyssa Vance," he murmured. "Good. Every service they relied on, every floral shipment, every event delivery, now traced back to Rhodes' atelier." He leaned back, eyes heavy but satisfied. The structure was in place. All it needed now was time to collapse under its own illusion. Days later, Alyssa began to notice small things going wrong. A shipment of imported decor was delayed. A venue double-booked their date. A supplier emailed an apology citing internal restructuring. She dismissed it at first, but the pattern grew. One by one, their trusted partners stumbled. Elliot raged, firing managers, replacing staff. "Someone's sabotaging us," he shouted during a meeting. Alyssa said nothing, but a quiet dread sat in her stomach. The timing, the precision, it all felt too deliberate. One evening, she decided to visit one of their suppliers in person. The man behind the desk smiled politely when she arrived. "We've had some ownership changes recently," he explained. "You'll need to direct payments to our new parent company." He handed her a business card. The logo at the top read Rhodes Atelier Holdings. Her hand froze midair. This can't be right," she stammered. The man tilted his head. "You didn't know? They own half the vendors in this city now." That night, Alyssa drove home in silence, the city lights blurring through her tears. She'd built her new life on someone else's foundation, again his. Nate's quiet revenge wasn't loud or cruel. It was architectural. Every transaction she made, every event she hosted, every dollar she earned circled back to him. She whispered into the steering wheel, voice cracking. "He's everywhere." Back at Rhodes' atelier, Nate stood before a glass wall overlooking the city, watching storm clouds roll over the skyline. His reflection stared back at him, steadier, harder. He didn't smile. He simply whispered to the ghost of the woman who'd once walked away. "You built your house on borrowed ground, Alyssa. Now let's see if it stands. The storm broke 2 weeks later, not in thunder, but in headlines. The Monarch brand faces sudden financial crisis, suppliers withdraw contracts, rumors of internal mismanagement rock power couple. The articles spread like wildfire. Nate didn't have to lift a finger. The world was already doing the work. He sat in his office, sipping black coffee as the morning news played quietly in the background. The anchor's voice was calm, clinical, devastating. Sources confirm several companies under Monarch's portfolio have filed complaints for unpaid debts and breaches of contract. Insiders report the company's future may be in jeopardy. Nate muted the television, the corners of his mouth barely twitching. Across town, Alyssa stormed into the Monarch offices, heels striking the marble floor like gunfire. The staff avoided her eyes, whispering in corners. She found Elliot pacing by the glass window, phone pressed to his ear. "We'll fix it," he was saying. "We just need another extension, hello?" The call disconnected. He threw the phone onto the desk. "Everyone's jumping ship. Vendors, clients gone." Alyssa slammed a file onto the table. "I went through every contract, Elliot. All our major suppliers. They're under Rhodes Atelier Holdings. Nate owns them." He stared at her, disbelieving. "That's impossible. He's smarter than you think," she cut in. "And he's been planning this. Every deal, every connection. He's already inside our walls." Elliot ran a hand through his hair, panic flickering across his face. "He wouldn't. He's too soft for this." Alyssa laughed bitterly. "Not anymore." By evening, creditors began calling. The company's accounts were frozen pending audit. The luxury cars were repossessed. Even their penthouse lease was under review. Alyssa tried reaching Nate once, just once, dialing his old number from memory. It rang twice, then went dead. No voicemail. No closure. She threw the phone across the room and sank to the floor, trembling. That same night, Nate met with his legal team, in quiet confidence. "Everything's moving as expected," his lawyer reported. "Monarch's liabilities are folding into your holdings seamlessly." Nate nodded. "No press, no leaks," he said softly. "I don't want a circus, just the truth." His voice was steady, but something human flickered behind it, a trace of the man who had once loved too much. After the meeting, he stepped out onto the balcony, the city lights glimmering like embers below. Rain began to fall again, gentle but relentless. Samantha joined him, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You've been quiet," she said. "Is it over?" He shook his head. "Not yet. The building hasn't fallen, it's only cracked." She studied his face. "And when it does?" He looked out into the night. "Then I'll walk away." Across the city, Alyssa watched her empire unravel on a glowing laptop screen. Every contract canceled, every client gone. She whispered to herself, "He saved my life, and now he's taking it back." The irony cut sharper than any betrayal she'd ever given. For the first time, she understood what it meant to lose everything, not through force, but precision. Morning light spilled over Dallas, but for Alyssa and Elliot, it brought no warmth, only headlines. Fraud investigation underway. Monarch brand under scrutiny. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters camped outside their gates, cameras flashing whenever the door cracked open. Alyssa sat by the window, clutching her robe, staring at her reflection in the glass. The woman staring back looked older, hollowed, like her bones were made of fear. Elliot was on his 3rd whiskey before noon. "They're digging into everything," he muttered, scrolling through his phone. "Contracts, loans, transfers, someone fed them the files." Alyssa's voice was barely a groan, a whisper. "Not someone. Nate." He laughed without humor. "You're giving him too much credit." But when he opened his email, his laughter died. Attached was a subpoena. Rhodes v. Vance et al. Petition for misappropriation of marital assets. The plaintiff's name glared in bold letters. Nathaniel Rhodes. Court dates followed like rain. Each hearing stripped away another illusion. Nate's lawyers moved with silent precision, presenting transaction logs, time-stamped transfers, and signature analyses. Alyssa watched in horror as her own name appeared on documents she hadn't even remembered signing. "You emptied the joint account to fund Monarch," the judge said sternly. "Do you dispute that, Mrs. Vance?" Her mouth opened, but no words came. Elliot glared at her from the defendant's table, realizing she'd dragged him into the same grave. Nate never once looked at her directly. He sat composed, hands folded, listening as his lawyers dismantled the empire she'd built on his trust. When the court recessed, Alyssa approached him in the hallway. "Nate," she whispered, voice trembling. "Please, you don't have to do this." He turned, eyes calm, unreadable. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't have to, but I will." Then he walked away, leaving her surrounded by silence and flashing cameras. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. "Mr. Rhodes, any comment on the case?" He paused just long enough to say, "Truth doesn't need noise. It stands on its own." The line made the evening news, and the world hailed him as a man of quiet justice. When the verdict came weeks later, it was brutal. The court awarded Nate full restitution and ownership of all remaining Monarch assets. Alyssa was ordered to repay the stolen funds. Elliot's face went pale when the judge announced the investigation into tax fraud. The bailiff's voice echoed as court adjourned, and for the first time, Alyssa felt the full weight of what she'd done not just to him, but to herself. That night, she returned to the penthouse to find movers already dismantling her life. Boxes labeled eviction notice lined the walls. She sat on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, as the city lights flickered outside. "He said he builds what lasts," she murmured, remembering Nate's words from years ago. "And I built lies." Across the city, Nate stood on the balcony of his office, the wind tugging at his coat. Samantha stepped beside him. "It's over," she said quietly. He nodded. "No," he replied. "This was just the courtroom. The real judgment hasn't started yet." The following weeks were a slow, public unraveling of everything Alyssa once called success. The news cycle refused to move on. Her face appeared on every gossip blog, each headline sharper than the last. "Dallas socialite faces ruin. The woman who betrayed the man who saved her life." She couldn't step outside without feeling the burn of flashing cameras or the sting of whispers that followed. Wherever she went, even the people who once clung to her presence at galas now crossed the street to avoid her. Her phone, once alive with invitations, now only rang with calls from creditors and lawyers. Her credit cards were frozen. The penthouse lease was terminated. Elliot had vanished, his number disconnected, his name dragged deeper into the fraud investigation. She was left in a half-empty apartment filled with echoes of a life that had already ended. At night, she'd sit by the window, staring out at the skyline. Nate once dreamed of shaping. "You saved me from dying," she whispered into the darkness, "and I repaid you by killing everything that was good." Across the city, Nate's world moved in the opposite direction, calm, deliberate, ascending. Rhodes' atelier flourished quietly, its designs appearing in every architectural journal. Investors lined up to work with him, impressed not only by his genius, but by his restraint. When one journalist asked about his court victory, Nate replied simply, "Peace doesn't come from winning, it comes from letting truth do the work." The quote went viral. People began to see him as a symbol of dignity and redemption, the man who rose without rage. He never gloated. He didn't attend the interviews, didn't celebrate with champagne. He spent most evenings with Samantha, reviewing designs for the new Phoenix Tower, a project dedicated to second chances. She often stayed late at his office, sitting beside him as rain tapped the windows. "You've done it," she said softly one night. "You've built something bigger than revenge." Nate glanced at the blueprint spread before him, clean lines, open spaces, light pouring through glass. "It's not revenge anymore," he said. "It's balance." Still, small ghosts lingered. When he walked past a cafe and caught the faint scent of Alyssa's old perfume, his steps slowed. He didn't turn, didn't search for her, but memories flickered her, laughter before ambition twisted it, the way she'd once looked at him with trust. The ache was gentle now, not consuming. It lived in him like a scar that no longer hurt, only reminded. One evening, a courier arrived at Rhodes' atelier carrying an unmarked envelope. Inside was $50 and a note written in delicate handwriting, "For the people who lost what I once threw away." There was no signature, but he recognized the curves of her script instantly. He stood by the window for a long time, turning the paper between his fingers. Finally, he placed it in the corner of his desk, beneath the photograph of the Phoenix Tower's foundation. Samantha saw it later and asked, "Old memory?" He smiled faintly. A closing chapter. As night settled, the city lights glowed beneath him. Somewhere out there, The woman he'd once saved was learning what it meant to rebuild from ashes. And for the first time in years, Nate felt the quiet peace of a man who no longer needed to save or destroy, only to live. Months turned into a full year, and the rhythm of life shifted again, steady, purposeful, quiet. Nate moved into a modest house by White Rock Lake, trading glass towers for sunlight and silence. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and the sound of birds instead of ringing phones. Samantha had become part of that rhythm, her laughter in the kitchen, her gentle presence filling the empty spaces that used to echo with memory. There was no grand confession between them, no sudden declaration of love. It grew naturally, like light through curtains, soft, patient, inevitable. One morning, as they shared breakfast by the window, Samantha looked up from her cup and said, "You've been smiling in your sleep lately." Nate chuckled. "Maybe I'm finally tired enough to rest." She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "No," she said softly. "You're finally at peace." Later that week, Nate visited the Phoenix Tower construction site, the skyscraper that now symbolized his rebirth. Workers moved with precision around him, beams gleaming in the sunday. When he reached the top floor, still unfinished, he looked out over Dallas, the skyline stretching in all directions. He thought of everything that had brought him there, the accident, the betrayal, the courtroom, the silence after. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like understanding. He whispered, "Out of ashes, we rise," then smiled faintly, not for anyone else but for himself. Across town, Alyssa lived in a small rented apartment above a bakery. She worked mornings delivering flower arrangements for events she once hosted, sometimes catching glimpses of familiar faces who pretended not to recognize her. Yet, there was something different about her now: humility, where arrogance used to live, calm where vanity once screamed. She didn't curse Nate for what had happened. She no longer hated him. In rare moments, she even thanked him silently for forcing her to confront the woman she'd become. One Sunday, she attended a small church service. The pastor spoke about forgiveness, about how some wounds aren't meant to vanish, but to teach. When it was time for testimonies, she surprised herself by standing. "Once," she said, her voice trembling, "someone saved my life. And I thought that meant I could do anything, take anything, because I'd already paid my debt to fate. But I was wrong. Love isn't a debt, it's a responsibility. And when you break it, you lose more than people. You lose yourself." The congregation sat in silence, her tears falling freely. "I can't undo what I've done," she whispered, "but I can live differently from now on." Later, as she walked home beneath the afternoon sun, she paused outside a bookstore window. Inside, a magazine displayed Nate's photo on its cover, Nathaniel Rhodes, the architect of renewal. Her lips curved into a faint smile, bittersweet but honest. "You did it," she murmured. "You really rose." That night, back at his home, Nate stood on the porch beside Samantha, watching the sun dip into gold and violet. "Do you ever think about her?" Samantha asked gently. He nodded once. "Sometimes, but not with anger, just gratitude. She taught me what I should never build again." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time, the silence between them felt whole. The evening air was cool and weightless, a gentle wind stirring through the trees around the lake. The Phoenix Tower was finally complete, its mirrored glass catching the fading sunlight, casting long streaks of gold across the skyline. The city had come to call it Dallas's Tower of Forgiveness, a name Nate never chose but didn't reject. He designed it not to glorify himself, but to remind anyone who looked at it that even broken things could stand tall again. The grand opening ceremony drew a quiet crowd: architects, investors, artists, and community leaders. Samantha stood beside him in a pale blue dress, her calm presence grounding him more than the applause ever could. Reporters gathered, microphones extended, camera flashes slicing through twilight. Nate stepped forward, his voice firm yet reflective. "This building," he began, "was born from loss. It was shaped by pain, rebuilt by patience, and finished by grace. Every scar, every betrayal, every ending in my life has led here. And tonight, I want this tower to stand not as a monument to me, but as proof that no destruction is final." The audience fell silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. Samantha looked at him with quiet pride, and for a second, Nate caught his reflection in the building's glass. Stronger, older, but peaceful. It felt right. Far away in her small apartment, Alyssa watched the same ceremony on television. Her hands trembled as the camera panned across the glowing tower. The words, "Out of ashes, we rise," engraved near its base. Her eyes filled, not with jealousy, but with awe. "He made beauty out of what I ruined," she whispered. She reached for the remote but hesitated when Nate's speech replayed. His voice, calm and steady, filled the room. "Forgiveness," he said, "isn't about letting others go. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what they did to you." Alyssa pressed her palm against the screen as tears slid down her cheeks. "You freed me too," she whispered. At the tower's reception, a journalist approached Nate with a final question. "If you could say one thing to the people who betrayed you," she asked softly, "what would it be?" Nate thought for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the glowing skyline. "Thank you," he said finally. "You taught me that pain isn't the opposite of peace, it's the path to it." When the ceremony ended, Nate and Samantha walked along, the lakeside hand in hand, the city lights shimmering on the water. "You did it," she said quietly. "You turned your wounds into wings." He smiled. "No," he murmured. "We did." The wind shifted, carrying the distant echo of laughter. Maybe memory, maybe the past fading into peace. At that same moment, Alyssa stood on her tiny balcony, gazing at the tower's reflection in the water. For the first time in years, she didn't feel hatred or sorrow, just stillness. "Out of ashes, we rise," she repeated softly. The lights of the Phoenix Tower glimmered against her tears, like forgiveness itself was reaching for her from across the city. Night draped over Dallas in velvet stillness. The city hummed softly beneath the stars, its towers glowing like quiet sentinels. From the balcony of his lakefront home, Nathaniel Rhodes stood with a glass of water in his hand, gazing toward the skyline where the Phoenix Tower rose, his final testament to everything he had endured, lost, and reclaimed. The structure shimmered faintly, a symbol not of wealth or revenge, but of rebirth. Samantha joined him, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the cool breeze. "You've been out here a while," she said gently. "Thinking?" Nate smiled faintly without turning. "Not thinking, just remembering." She leaned on the railing beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You always go quiet before a new chapter." He chuckled softly. Maybe because the last one finally closed. They stood together in silence, watching the city pulse with distant light. A sense of completion hung in the air, the kind that doesn't come from winning, but from understanding. Samantha reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "You know," she said, "some people spend their whole lives trying to get even. You got whole." He glanced at her, his eyes calm and clear. "Getting even doesn't rebuild anything. But peace builds forever." Across the city, in a quiet neighborhood, Alyssa sat by her window, a single candle flickering beside her. On the table lay an open journal, its pages filled with words she would never send. Letters to the man she once destroyed. Apologies she would never speak aloud. She'd started volunteering at a local shelter, helping women find jobs, donating time instead of money she no longer had. The act of giving without glamour, without attention, felt foreign at first. Then, slowly, it began to feel like redemption. She lifted her gaze to the skyline and saw it, the Phoenix Tower, glowing against the night, its reflection rippling across the dark water. For a long time, she simply stared, letting tears roll down her cheeks. "He built light out of my darkness," she whispered, "and I hope he never looks back." At that same moment, Nate set his glass down and turned to Samantha. "Come with me," he said. They walked to his studio, where the final framed blueprint of the Phoenix Tower hung on the wall. Beneath it, a blank canvas waited on an easel. He picked up a pencil and began sketching softly, lines crossing with patience and grace. Samantha tilted her head. "What are you building now?" she asked. He smiled, his hands steady. "A home. For us. Something simple this time, no marble, no steel, just peace." When he finished the outline, he stepped back. The drawing wasn't of a tower or a mansion, but a lakeside cottage surrounded by trees, sunlight streaming through the windows. Samantha looked at it and whispered, "It's beautiful." Nate exhaled, the faintest tremor of emotion in his voice. "It's enough." Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, not a storm, just the earth reminding him that every ending carries its own beginning. He turned off the lights, took Samantha's hand, and together they stood at the window one last time. The reflection of the Phoenix Tower shimmered across the water, steady and golden. Nate whispered, almost to himself, "Out of ashes, we rise, and then we rest." The wind shifted, carrying faint traces of rain and memory across the lake. Alyssa blew out her candle miles away. Samantha leaned into Nate's shoulder, and the city settled into its quiet rhythm. The story had come full circle, not in vengeance, but in peace.